Hi, everybody. This is Maurice Merrick, and welcome back to Horsepower Heritage. First, I have to say thank you for all the support surrounding the launch of the podcast. I appreciate all the emails you've sent and the reviews, and I'm glad you enjoyed the first episode. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. I've got a great season planned for you. My guest for this episode is Basem Wasef. Basem is an automotive journalist and a producer, a true professional, and he's driven just about everything under the sun. He's the author of 3 books, and I'll put some links in the show notes so you can check them out for yourself. Basem also appeared recently on the new panel show Shift Talkers, which is available on Motor Trend On Demand. I had a wide-ranging discussion with Basem about his early fascination with cars, his career, where the auto industry is going, the Tesla Cybertruck, Sterling Moss. We covered a lot of ground, but what was clear throughout our conversation is just how much he loves cars and motorcycles. So I hope you enjoy part 1 of my interview with Basem Wasef. And away we go. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. My name is Maurice Merrick, and today I have a fantastic guest. This gentleman is a freelance automotive journalist and producer. He's written for Automobile, Wired, The Rob Report, and others. He's also the author of 3 books, Legendary Racecars, Legendary Motorcycles, and 1 volume of the Speed Read series, Supercar. Basem Wasef, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
How are you, buddy? Strange times we're living in.
I'm doing actually really well. This is a very big lifestyle adjustment for me. I'm usually traveling quite a bit extensively all over the world. Usually 1 to 2 trips to Europe per month. I'm gone probably 40% of the time. So being at home essentially 100% of the time is just like mind-blowing to me. It's a totally different experience. And I know it's a really tough time for a lot of people, but I'm actually really getting a lot of good stuff out of this. So it's been great so far.
Well, I'm really pleased that we could set this up today. You know, my goal for the series has always been to have my guests in studio with me, and I'm committed to that in the future. But for now, this is fantastic, and I just appreciate you joining us.
Hey, it's great to be here, man.
It strikes me, Basem, that you get paid to do what most people would do for free.
Yeah. So, I never really envisioned this happening the way it happened. I didn't plan this career. I was an English. I had kind of all the background going before I knew it, but the way it converged was very strange. Always been a car and motorcycle enthusiast. It's just been in my blood. Like my parents tell me that I used to sing "Happy Birthday" to my Matchbox cars when I was really young. So that was always there. I used to read car magazines when I was a kid. I was an English major at UCLA, but I always thought I was going to do something different. And I was working in film and TV when I came across an opportunity to contribute to a local magazine in LA that was a high-end luxury magazine on cars for their car column. And I thought, that'd be a fun little side hobby. I'll kind of just toy with that a little bit and do that. But it just snowballed. And when you're that attracted to the subject matter and the lifestyle and the things that go around it, I'll just never forget the first press trip that I went on. I just couldn't believe that I was surrounded by people who were so like-minded. I was meeting race car drivers. I was driving on a racetrack with them and getting tips from them in really fast cars. And I just could not resist it. I was like, I've got to do more of this. It was like a drug. And
yeah, that's got to be a pretty heady experience because I imagine, you're thrust into this environment with some really heavy hitters.
Yeah.
And you're welcomed. You're embraced by that community. I'm sure the learning curve is steep, but also just taking it all in, it must have been overwhelming.
It's overwhelming and meeting a lot of your heroes and, in kind of environments that are like you only dreamed of them when you were a kid, being at Villa d'Este on Lake Como, seeing these priceless cars roll out, just beautiful works of art, I mean, I had been going to Pebble Beach for years on my own dime, and kind of feeling like you're on the outside looking in. And then when somebody invites you to stay at the lodge and hang out with Sterling Moss and, take a helicopter ride over it all, and here's as much champagne as you want. I remember like in college, like, gosh, can I do a $25 glass of champagne when I got to pay for gas on the way home? So just a totally different experience. I never really take it for granted. I think that's kind of the upside, even though this job has its own challenges, and it's not always easy. And especially in this climate now, things have changed so much. But you've got to remind yourself that, this is what you dreamed of doing. And, sometimes you think about the alternative and you're like, okay, this is why I do it.
Are there any particular challenges to writing in the automotive sphere?
It's been an interesting process over the years, and it's been a different experience because I got to say it was easier for me in the beginning because I had gestated all these thoughts in my head for decades, literally, and it's based on formative experiences and formative opinions and formative intake of material. So, reading Automobile magazine as a kid, reading Road and Track, Car and Driver, you build this sort of like inner vocabulary in your head. And cars are an interesting juncture of so many different factors because they're engineering, but they're also emotional, but they're also visceral. There's marketing in there. There's preconceived notions. So I was full to the brim of stuff I wanted to say when I started in this career. And I feel like I said a lot of that. So the challenge becomes, after you've been doing it a few years, how do I keep my voice fresh? How do I say things that I haven't said before? How do I keep my verbal signature unique? And that's a bit of a challenge, and I think any writer faces that in any field. But cars are their own kind of unique challenge because there's so many cliches out there. You're always trying to go beyond the cliches. You're always trying to say things in new and interesting ways, and that gets harder the more you do it. It gets to be a different kind of challenge.
Absolutely. And there are so many publications out there now, not just print media, obviously, but on the web. Just the sheer output, a lot of it is a little bit numbing when you read it. Obviously, you've been an enthusiast since you were a child, and I imagine that you kind of were like a sponge even early on, soaking up technical details and also probably learning from the writing at that time.
Absolutely. I mean, I grew up with a real sense of storytelling about cars. Of course, I love the nuts and bolts and the tech talk and what makes exceptional cars exceptional from an engineering standpoint. But I also grew up reading Peter Egan telling stories about interaction with machines and the predicaments they put you into, and how people look at you when you're in these vehicles, and all the kind of sociological things that come with these machines. Because it's easy to get into the appliance mindset when you're reviewing a car, because there's so much stuff to talk about that's comparative to other things in its field, and how does it perform, and is it reliable, and how's the fuel economy. But when you get past that, I think that's where it gets engaging. That's why I like writing for a number of different outlets, many of which have a lifestyle angle that looks at the big picture. It looks not just about the nuts and bolts, but about what makes a vehicle trigger something that you can't necessarily capture in a spec sheet or something rational like that.
Right. Yeah. By the way, I have sitting here on the desk a copy of Grand Prix Cars by Dennis Jenkinson. This is an original 1959 edition.
Amazing.
And I was just reading Jenks on his trip with Sterling Moss on the 55 Mille Miglia, and what a fantastic story that is.
It's unbelievable. The record that will never be broken, partially because they just don't, they can't hit those speeds now. legally, and they don't close off the road in the same continuous way that they used to do the Mille Miglia, for the course of essentially a full day of flat out driving. Jenks is an unsung hero for being able to manage the driver in a way that enabled full tilt driving, but being right on it and knowing what was coming up. And they spent a lot of time, the two of them, pre-routing the course, driving it, making detailed notes on the road, the turns, the degree of turns, the crest, what was over that blind hill. And it's just an amazing accomplishment. It's so epic. And you could never do that today.
Yeah, I think it's well known, among enthusiasts, both Jenks and Moss, admitted that they didn't think a non-Italian could win the Mille Miglia unless they applied some system management to the whole thing, if for lack of a better term. And so you're right, they did that pre-run of the course, and Jenks had all of his notes. And you're right. I mean, an amazing feat, never to be repeated.
Yeah, absolutely. I was lucky to do the Mille Miglia in 2018, and even with modern legal restrictions, there are a lot of exceptions that make you go, wow, I can't believe we just did that.
Yeah, let's talk about that experience. What car were you in? Who were you with? And how did it go down?
So I was sponsored by Mercedes-Benz. I was in a 300 SL Gullwing. My co-driver was Sean Evans, he's a colleague, automotive journalist. And, when you break it down over several days, it makes you really appreciate the fact that A, it's still exhausting, and B, they did it all the way full tilt back in the day. The car is phenomenal. The engineering that they had in the mid 1950s that Mercedes-Benz had was truly exceptional. And, a lot of people don't think about the 300 SL as a supercar because all the flashy Lamborghinis and Ferraris tend to get the attention. But for its time, it was so advanced. It's even by modern standards, it's pretty remarkable. Now, what the Italian police do with this event is really special, because if you're lucky enough to get a motorcycle cop, because they have a lot of motorcycle escorts that take you through the course and clear the way for you and help you along, what they do is basically give you carte blanche as long as you follow them to just go like the wind. And they'll go around traffic and they'll wave you around and they'll stop, through intersections to let you through. And I remember this one particular stretch where we were just flying. We were going so fast. And they knew where the speed traps were, so they wouldn't go through a speed camera at speed. But when you go, an hour flat out following a motorcycle cop, and then we had this one where he finally slowed down and stopped near the checkpoint and said, "You like?" Just this knowing, like, yes, thank you. Yeah, the Italians are very special about speed. And, seeing the recognition on the locals when you come into a village and you slow down and the mayor does his little presentation and passes out things. And, there's a whole like kind of dog and pony show aspect to it in these little towns. The kids and their enthusiasm and waving flags and going crazy. I mean, like, we need more of that in the world. I mean, there's so much unfriendliness towards the automobile these days in major cities, closing off lanes of highways and banning vintage cars and eventually banning internal combustion cars. This is one of the true holdouts that's like a whole national embrace of the automobile. It's really inspirational.
I wouldn't be the first to argue that motorsport is really the national sport of Italy. It's always been a point of national pride from day one of the automobile, and they have had some of the most incredible road races anywhere in the world. That experience, was it almost like a time machine for you in a sense?
It was one of the most time machine-y automotive experiences I've ever done, because you're surrounded by a sea of cars from the period,
Right.
all of that period, nothing modern. You do get a little bleed in the periphery, pace cars, and sometimes you're getting around traffic and whatever. But when you're chasing a 550 speedster, 550A, down a windy road, and it's just the two of you, and there's a Ferrari behind you, it's like you do get this, like, oh my God, this is like a dream. Another experience that was a real time travel for me was Goodwood Revival, because that's a unique experience because you're on Lord March's premises and you're not allowed past the door if you're not wearing period clothes. So not only is everyone dressed in period, the buildings are period, all the vehicles are period, the motorcycles, the cars, there's Spitfires flying above, they've got reenactments of World War II radio broadcasts, and it's like an incredible experience. So England too has this like really deep appreciation for motorsports history that's still alive.
Yeah, that fully immersive environment of Goodwood is something that I hope to experience for myself soon someday. You told us that during the Mille Miglia that you participated in, the car you were in was a 300 SL, and you used the word supercar, and I agree with you 100%. I think it is the world's first supercar. Now, it could be argued that the Grand Prix Bugattis and Alphas of the 20s and 30s would fit the bill too, but let's not forget that those were race cars, and the 300 SL was not simply a race car, but was also a road car.
Yeah.
And so I think that bona fide that makes it the first supercar in my book.
And it did borrow Grand Prix technology, which is really what made it stand out, because anyone can build a road car based on previous road cars, but it's not until you trickle down from racing that you get something that's so much more capable. Modern example of that, Lamborghini for a long time was not taken seriously in performance circles because they were more about flash than they were about absolute performance, like something you would not be afraid to literally race on the track, not just take on a track day and have some fun with. But it wasn't until the current gen Huracan, in my opinion, that they really got a lot of GT3 technology into the car, into the foundation of the car, to make it competent on a racetrack. And it's that difference between driving at 7/10 or 8/10 on the road versus driving 9 or 10/10 on a racetrack that makes all the difference for me in terms of differentiation.
Basem, you came of age in the 1980s when really that was sort of a golden moment for supercars.
Mm-hmm.
Was that influential to you? I mean, I think we all had posters of a 911 Turbo or a late model Countach.
100%. It started with car magazines and seeing them on the cover of car magazines and reading about them. And this sort of, it's like next level aspiration. It's like, I don't want to own a regular 911. I want the turbo, I don't want a regular car. I want a Countach. And it's so fantastical, especially when your mind is young and developing. You're thinking of these things as like, these are alien spaceships. They're not even cars, And that still, gets me going still. But it's like something that really planted a seed in terms of looking beyond the immediate. Definitely.
And, to me, what's so cool about that time period is that, we were coming out of the gas crisis of the 70s and that Malaise era of automobiles that GM and Ford and Chrysler were building. And those are, most American production cars from those years are totally forgettable. But that sort of supercar vibe or supercar aesthetic did trickle down. For example, the VW GTI or the Fox Body Mustang, those cars had a certain flash, a certain swagger that I think was influenced by cars like the Countach.
Absolutely. It's when you think about a car maker and what they're selling, racing is a really hard financial proposition. But when you talk about an image of a race car and an image of a street car, what it stands to inherit is so great. VW Group, I think, has done a really good job of completely immersing in racing. Bentley races now, Audi races. Audi, well, until recently was racing at the very highest level of endurance racing. Lamborghini, you know, all of this stuff is really important for a brand, even if it doesn't make money, because you've got to prove that you're serious. You know, you're not just a luxury brand, you're a luxury performance brand. And something's got to stoke that desire, because there's so much good stuff out there. You know, Ferrari's been doing it forever. Porsche's been doing it forever. And that's the challenge I think that newer brands face. You know, like Genesis is a great luxury brand, but the heritage is just a couple years old. You know, it's 5 years old maybe. So how do they prove themselves? You know, how do they get out there? They've got to do something to legitimize who they are, what their brand DNA is, and define that. And it takes time. It takes decades.
And, you know, the old cliche is that racing improves the breed, but it's really true.
Absolutely.
So Basem, am I right? You grew up in London?
Until I was 6 years old. Yeah. Oh, and just jumping back to that racing thing, I'm looking at the GT40 behind you.
Oh yeah.
And you know, that's the ultimate example, right? Like Ford was selling cars back then, but they just weren't cool. And
absolutely,
the way to legitimize the brand was to go to Le Mans and beat Ferrari. I mean, I love the story because it's so elemental. It's so kind of like primal in a way. It's like the David and Goliath story, you know? And we can't beat Ferrari. We can't buy Ferrari. We're going to beat them on the racetrack. I love that.
Basem, tell me about your first gig.
I will never forget my first assignment. So Brentwood Magazine, which is was a local luxury magazine in Los Angeles, had an ad out for an automotive writer. And I contacted them and I said, hey, you know, I'd love to write for you guys. And they said, well, do you have any samples of your work? And I said, well, no, not for automotive, but I can write something just to show you what I know what I'm talking about. So I wrote a little spec one-off piece, and the editor saw that I knew a thing or two about cars and said, okay, sure. Why don't you write for a summer issue about convertibles, high-end convertibles. Find 4 really nice convertibles and write a little piece about them. So I cold called all the manufacturers I could, and literally within about a week and a half, I had a Maserati Spider, I had a Porsche 911 Cabriolet, I had an AMG SL AMG 55, and I had a Aston Martin DB9 or DB7 Volante in my garage. So
that's a pretty quick hookup.
I went from zero to drug dealer basically overnight. All my neighbors are like, "What's going on here?" And I wrote the piece, and it did great, and they liked it, and they asked for more. So Porsche calls me up and says, "Hey, we're doing the launch of the 911 GT3 at Virginia National Raceway. Do you want to come test the car and write about it?" And I'll never forget this. I said, "I'd love to. Let me just call my editor to make sure that they can pay for me to get there." And the guy on the other line, the late, great Bob Carlson, said, "Oh, we'll take care of that. Don't worry." I'm like, "Oh, you're going to pay for, oh, wow. Okay, cool. I'm in."
Wow. That's how this works. Yeah.
This is how this business works. Yeah, it was amazing.
Count me in, right?
Exactly. I can do that.
Basem, you're also an avid motorcyclist.
Absolutely. Yeah. Love bikes.
Is there a particular kind of bike or kind of riding that you like, or?
You know, I do. I mean, in a way, it's all good, but I gravitate towards bikes with an extra dose of soul, if you will. There's something about Italian bikes to me, like, you know, I love a good Italian bike. They've got just so much personality. Not to say that there isn't something great about riding BMW GS off-road, because it's really good at that. Or a Japanese bike on a racetrack, because they're really good at that. But Italian bikes just speak to me because there's an intent that's so clear in the way that they're built. And they're so involving emotionally. And to me, like, if you're not emotionally invested in a motorcycle, like, what's the point, right? Like, you may as well just get in a car. You'll get air conditioning and safety and all the other things that come with being in a car. But like, you know, the MV Agustas, the Ducatis in particular, they really reverberate with me, you know, and riding a motorcycle is such an individual experience. Um, you're literally wrapping your body around the machine. So you've got to be at one with it. And if you're not exactly at one, at least you're interacting with it in a way that is involving. But when you're uncomfortable on a bike, it's the worst. Whether that's the exterior conditions, whether you're freezing or it's too hot, or you just don't fit right and your wrists are cramping because the ergonomics are off. Riding is a very all or nothing process, but when it works, it's so good.
I totally agree with you. And I've said this before, but I think motorcycling is one of those things that is so healing in terms of your mental focus and everything, because you really are, that's all you care about at the moment. And so you can empty your mind.
You have to empty your mind. There's no there's no multitasking, there's no distractions. And I have ridden listening to music on Bluetooth. I have taken calls on Bluetooth. There are things that you can be doing. You can be glancing down at a GPS, but in its purest essence, I think it's just you, the machine on the road. Like, that's the way it really ought to be.
Are you a solo rider, or do you ride with friends, or does it matter?
I enjoy solo riding for that mind clearing process and experience. And I do ride with friends that I trust. But you have to trust them because there's so much that can go wrong out there. And, and if there's somebody I'm riding with that feels like if I haven't ridden with them before and they feel like they've really got to be in front, go in front. I'd rather ride at my own pace, and feel comfortable than feel like it's a competition, dicing on the road.
Hey, let's talk about criticism in automotive writing. Is it tough to be a critic? Is it tough to be objective? Do you feel pressure to censor yourself at times?
It's a really good question. The way the industry works is sort of unlike any other, in that in order to get access to these vehicles at an early point in the vehicle's lifespan, the numbers are stacked against you, especially if it's a really desirable machine. If a car manufacturer is choosing 12 people to go to the long lead of a car that won't be available again for another 3 months in the States, they're going to pick those dozen people very carefully. It's just numbers. It's a numbers game. If they're going to fly you to the Nürburgring to drive, the hot new number on the racetrack, you're probably part of a small group of people. And that said, it puts pressure on you. There is an unspoken pressure of we did all this for you, but the bottom line is you've got to be honest. You've got to really be objective in your opinions, and you've got to remove all the great hotel that you stay at from your head, and the great dinners and the great drinks and all the stuff that comes with it, and focus on the car. That's the bottom line. You're there for the car, and sure, there's a lot of side stuff that gets thrown into the mix, but at the end of the day, you're there to give an honest opinion about the car. Now, the great thing about the way the industry is now, that we didn't have in the print-only era, is that reviews get posted online and you can cross-reference opinions so quickly that it almost, in a way, is a way of keeping people honest. I feel like if I don't talk about a car's flaws, I'm doing a disservice to the person that's going to go plunk down a huge amount of money on this machine. If there's something that doesn't feel right, even though you'd think it would feel right, if it's a $150,000 car, but there's a piece of plastic on the steering wheel that touches your hand, and you're like, why is this here on this expensive car? I feel it's a duty to bring that up. And then there's layers to that, of course. It's not just, your impressions on the physical things. It's like, is this car really worthwhile? Why are they still building this car? Why does it exist?
Decades ago, it was not difficult to identify flaws in a car. Mm-hmm. We're talking about a time when, let's say, for instance, the period where disc brakes were a new thing, or ABS was a new thing, or some cars just didn't have power steering. Chassis design, body on frame versus unibody. These differences were very significant at one point in history, and now the engineering and the manufacturing is so tight across the spectrum. So really, the differences are a hair's width at times, wouldn't you say?
Oh, it's totally true. Not only are cars exponentially better now, exponentially more reliable, better built, higher performance. I mean, we live in an age where 500 horsepower, $40,000 cars are commonplace, $50,000 cars are commonplace. But beyond that, think about how many genres there are now. I mean, you look at car makers before, and they used to build, an entry-level car, maybe a mid-size sedan, and then, a bigger sedan that was higher end, maybe a sports car. But now we've got, SUVs that are ultra high performance that they call coupes because they're a little bit sleeker, but they're crossovers because they're more car-like, and you get parsed into all these tiny little segments. And I think that's really where car makers are differentiating themselves now. It's like, who are we? What's the core of our brand? And how do we do what we do well? Because you can go out and buy, an almost carbon copied version of this car from another car maker. So where does our differentiation come in? Where does our brand DNA make us feel like a different car? It's easy to get deceived by the commonly stated belief that all cars look the same now. Yeah, sure, it might be true because of bumper height regulations and crumple zones and all that stuff. But I think the real differentiator now is behind the wheel and in the cabin, and what you see, touch, and feel that makes you feel like you're in something that's special.
It's hilarious to me that we've reached a point in automotive development where car makers are actually trying to inject a mechanical, visceral feel back into the machine because they've become so seamless and so, tech heavy.
Absolutely. I mean, look at the Bugatti Veyron. On paper, like when I was a kid, if I saw that a car had 16 cylinders and produced over 1,000 horsepower, I wouldn't have believed it. It just sounds like sci-fi. Like, oh yeah, make up a number. That's insane. And yet the biggest criticism for that car was that it just didn't hit you here. Like, it was so good at what it was doing, could do 200 and whatever, 60 miles an hour. And it just wasn't making the driver feel connected to the machine. So that aspect of cars is really fascinating to me. The engineering required to bring emotion into the experience. I think it was the 488 Pista. It was at the launch of the 488 Pista, and Ferrari was talking about how they introduced a pulse of energy during the gear transfer to make the gear changes feel more emotional. And they didn't, it took them a long time to admit that that's what it was. But the idea that they're almost, it's like the difference between listening to a compact disc and an LP. It's like, on paper, the CD should be far superior because it's a perfect reproduction. It's ones and zeros, and it's the same every time. But what makes an LP sound good is the fuzziness. It's the imperfection. It's the flutter sometimes. There's all these kind of audiophile terms to describe the magic of analog and how that helps the sound. And, engineering is your friend, but it's also can be your enemy, I think, especially when you're chasing numbers. And a number of car makers have admitted that they hit a certain 0 to 60 number to make the headlines, to make the comparison, the comparo test between other sports cars so that they can win. And it's not necessarily the best for the car's character. So there's this weird kind of duality in automotive engineering and marketing as well, to grab people, because honestly, at the end of the day, it's really simple. It's like, there's the car and there's what people are saying about the car. And it could be the best car in the world, but if nobody says it or acknowledges it, it's almost like it doesn't matter, That's why fans are really important. That's why forums are important. And that's why journalism is important, to put these things into context.
I think your comparison with digital audio versus analog LPs is perfect. I know that I recall the debate over compact disc sound, and I'm sure you remember that too. A lot of people said it's cold and lifeless versus an LP, and no thank you.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there are plenty of automobiles that are packed with tech and very well engineered, but they leave you cold.
I mean, that's why the more I drive stuff, the more I prefer older stuff, to be honest. You can go out and spend big chunks of money on a car that's got all-wheel drive and launch control and torque vectoring to get you through the corner, and everything that on paper makes you a faster driver, but you've got to be going 200 miles an hour to feel something, and I used to I've had a couple of air-cooled Porsches that I loved, and I've got a Series 2A Land Rover that I adore. And I mean, maybe part of that is because I get access to really fast stuff and I get that out of my system and I get to enjoy nice, perfect cars. But for me, it's like I'm in less of a hurry now than I used to be to get from A to B. And I don't want more speeding tickets. So, there's something about the interaction with a machine that's really something reassuring about it.
All right, Basem, we're going to take a quick break, but we will be right back with more.
Sounds good.
That does it for part 1 of this episode. Don't miss part 2. Hit that subscribe button. And if you have questions or comments about the show, you can email me at horsepowerheritage@gmail.com. I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.